Israeli unrest at the catastrophe in Gaza is growing, as is global concern about the death and destruction, leaving Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu increasingly isolated on the world stage, as allies, including Australia, move to recognise Palestinian statehood. Netanyahu lashing out at Anthony Albanese, posting on X that history would remember Albanese as a weak politician who had betrayed Israel and abandoned Australia's Jews.
There's been an escalation in the diplomatic stoush between Australia and Israel, with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accusing Anthony Albanese of betraying the Jewish people in Australia and calling him a weak politician. And this is because Australia has finally announced that it will recognise Palestine. And there was also a separate issue where the Albanese government refused an entry visa to an ultra-nationalist Israeli MP during the week. But I think that we really need to look at what's happening here. This is all about Netanyahu playing out his propaganda games on the world stage. He needs to maintain political power back in Israel, and he's willing to abuse Albanese as an enemy of the state, or accuse him as the enemy of the state of Israel, to support or to rally support for his own government back in Tel Aviv, and also put pressure on the Australian government to reverse its support for the recognition of Palestine. That's what all of this is about. And he's done this deliberately, knowing that the Australian mainstream media would just run with the story and amplify the message and create or add to the domestic pressure on Anthony Albanese. But the problem for him is that it just didn't actually work. If anything, it made the Australian government ramp up its message against Netanyahu and call out the state of Israel for its actions in Gaza. Here's the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke.
Strength is not measured by how many people you can blow up or how many children you can leave hungry. Strength is much better measured by exactly what Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has done. When there's a decision that we know Israel won't like, he goes straight to Benjamin Netanyahu. He has the conversation, he says exactly what we're intending to do, and has the chance for the objections to be made person to person. And then, having heard them, makes a public announcement and does what needs to be done, which is to say without in any way compromising the long-standing view that every hostage needs to be released, without compromising the view that Hamas is a terrorist organisation which must play no role in a future Palestinian state, but to say to the Palestinian people, who at the moment must be feeling so invisible to the world, to say you are not invisible, we see you, we will recognise you, and that we will take the action that Australia has always believed needed to be taken, which is that we have two states, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, both secure, both recognised, both safe.
So this all ended up backfiring on Benjamin Netanyahu, and it showed him up to be the weak politician and not Anthony Albanese. And Tony Burke was right about all of this. The recognition of Palestine is long overdue, and barring extremists from entering Australia from Israel always has to be the right of the Australian government to decide. And I think it was John Howard in 2001 said,
"But we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come."
So if it worked for John Howard, it should be able to work for Anthony Albanese.
And yet Tony Abbott got here.
Yes. And Australia cannot back down on this, and nor should it. It should also be a question of whether Australia is willing to produce a foreign policy based on justice and accountability. And so far, it hasn't really done much on Palestine. I'll acknowledge that it is doing more on it compared to what it might have been doing up until a couple of months ago, but it cannot bend to an obvious propaganda campaign from Benjamin Netanyahu.
No, it was a ridiculous thing. And Netanyahu, that he would do this, suggests that he might not have the compromise on Australian politicians that we thought he might have. I think the bridge march changed the government's mind. Protest does work, particularly if you can get 300,000 of your best friends to come along. I think the ridiculous and insulting claims from the so-called envoy against anti-Semitism helped, in that even supporters looked at that and said, that's just beyond the pale. I think the pictures of starving children, of razed cities, and in the bigger centres, I think stories of families and friends who have been directly impacted by this have come through too. Maybe not so much in all areas, but I think those that might have been inclined to look at the Netanyahu government as part of a progressive only democracy in the Middle East, which it's not, by the way. I think the mood has changed, and I think that the government has been emboldened by the fact that more of the public will support it in these things than not. And that's as it should be. We've been very hard on Anthony Albanese over the last few weeks, but this week we seem to have softened, or at least I've seemed to have softened my approach to him. But good work deserves to be mentioned and praised. Could they be doing more? Yes. Should they be doing more? Yes. But compared to where we were 6 months ago, they've moved forward, and this is a good thing.
Oh, for sure, David. But I think the other point is that Benjamin Netanyahu is a thoroughly discredited leader. And that's why it benefits Anthony Albanese to call him out. Netanyahu's authority in Tel Aviv or in Israel is collapsing. There's been a wide range of protests against him in Tel Aviv over the past week. His international reputation is rubbish, pretty much. It's toxic amongst leaders in Europe. There's also an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu by the International Criminal Court, and every statement and action that he takes is designed to deflect from the reality of the political situation in Israel, and also to deflect from the genocide that he is causing in Gaza as well. And he's also played the Australian mainstream media like a violin yet again, and they just repeated his words uncritically, and his accusation that Albanese is weak and betrayal to the Jewish people in Australia, that became the headline news. And sure, these are the actual words that Netanyahu actually used, but to headline them in the way that the mainstream media did was designed by the conservative media to put a lot of pressure on Anthony Albanese over this issue. And this framing reinforced this propaganda rather than challenge it. And he's also so toxic that even the conservative Jewish lobby groups in Australia are starting to distance themselves from Netanyahu because they realise that he's becoming toxic to their cause as well. And I think the bigger question is, what does this mean for Australia-Israel relationships? Or I guess to be more precise, what does it actually mean for the relationship between Australia and the United States? And could it start seeping over to issues of trade and defence cooperation, the sharing of intelligence through the Five Eyes arrangement? And on the side of Australia, could it lead to sanctions and an arms embargo, or Australia supporting international legal action against Israel and Netanyahu? And the Labor backbencher, Ed Husich, well, he's consistently called on the federal government to implement sanctions against Israel, and he's ramped this up again this week. Here's what he had to say about it.
I think we need to work with our trusted friends and allies internationally in terms of sanctions. I think we should be prepared to ramp up sanctions. A lot of our sanctions so far are focused on activity in the West Bank, but there are, I'd say, looking at what's happening in Gaza, we do need to hold decision makers to account for what's happening in Gaza. I think that's really important, and we should remain open-minded about sanctions. And frankly, I do think we're going to need to escalate it because of the fact that people still are suffering from starvation, and the Netanyahu government doesn't seem to want to take a change of approach, even though their own people, Patricia. I mean, there are more and more Israelis protesting that the actions of the Netanyahu government aren't going to make it easier to bring hostages home, which should be released by Hamas absolutely immediately. They see this as an escalation that will not work in the interest of bringing back hostages, and that's what we really should be pushing for.
And surely this idea of sanctions just has to be a couple of steps away at the moment, because it seems like nothing else is going to stop Netanyahu's actions in Gaza, and this might be the most effective way and the only way of stopping him from continuing his actions in Israel and Gaza.
Netanyahu barred his own Attorney General from going to cabinet meetings because she's leading the investigation into his corruption. One, it's not really the actions of an innocent man with a clear conscience. And two, how can you hold a cabinet meeting without the vital legal advice that an Attorney General should give during that. Policies come through and they seem really good at the time, and then turns out, no, it's illegal because it transgresses this part of the law or that part of the law. Oh, so we've got to rethink it. Yep. Or you're Scott Morrison and you do it anyway. That ended well. I suspect that he won't be leader by the end of the year. I have a feeling that they might take him for a long one-way helicopter trip in which the helicopter doesn't land and he doesn't come back. It could be that. They could arrest him and go through due process too. That's probably the more likely thing. But it's not, he's not in a winning position, even compared to 6 months ago. Even when those of us who saw right through him, and those of us who saw right through him, saw through him back in 2000 and before, he's now in a position where people who were happy to support him have realised that he's not the person to support.
Oh, no, of course not. And it's pretty obvious it's all falling apart for Benjamin Netanyahu, and people in Israel are no longer buying into his politics of fear. Public opinion is shifting quite rapidly in Australia, and it's not just Australia, but there's so many allies of Israel that are starting to put pressure on Israel and starting to look at things quite differently. And part of this might be a sign of a changing global order as well. And I won't believe it until I actually see it all happening. But those leaders who rely on conflict to succeed are starting to be called out. And it's not necessarily resulting in action against them, but they're starting to be called out. And we do have to remember that international diplomatic action or international diplomacy just always takes a long time. And I think a big part of this is that people in those respective countries, and including Australia, well, they're just not accepting the rubbish anymore, that they're being fed by their leaders. They're demanding justice, they're demanding accountability, and they just want things to be done differently. And we'll have to see how this all translates into actions by our leaders. But it seems like the public is just way ahead on this particular issue, like they are on most issues, but they're way ahead on this issue, and the political leaders will have to hurry up and catch up because they're just so far behind that it's not funny anymore.
Yeah. There was a massive protest in Israel. It wasn't really reported. And this is where social media and independent media have shown their strength. Once the hegemony lost its control of the message, it was all over. It's all over for them. And we're seeing this in Netanyahu. We're seeing it in Trump. We saw it in Australia with the last couple of elections. You can control the message insofar as how you present the message, but you can't have that as the exclusive way the message is presented anymore. So as a result, the truth comes out. It's why Elon Musk buys Twitter. Twitter was really the major news source for the Arab Spring. It was the major news source for the Occupy movement. It was the major news. Now it's throttled and quite useless. Whereas...
But even still, information is still getting out there.
Information is still getting out there, yep. On Twitter, on Blue Sky, on Threads, on, to a lesser extent, Mastodon. Facebook is a mishmash of information, but careful curating can still get you to some part of the truth. Instagram, same thing. TikTok, Snapchat, all of those chipping into the hegemony of the mainstream media. And you can see in the flailing of things like Sky News, who are talking to an ever-shrinking bubble of like-minded thinkers.